Sangwon Suh, who I had a small bit to do in terms of us stealing him from the University of Minnesota, so I'm very glad that that was a successful steal. Any here from Minnesota, I'm sorry, but it was very productive. So, He's from Light University. He's written 3 books on life cycle assessment. He's a world-renowned expert in this field, and we're lucky to have him here at Santa Barbara.
Thank you.
His talk is Material Resources and Low Carbon Energy Technologies.
Thank you, John. So welcome to the seminar. So we don't have microphone here, so do you hear me well in the back? Okay, that's great. Okay, so today I will talk about material resources and low carbon energy technology. So there are a lot of interesting issues rising up. So I will first talk about a brief introduction of the topic, and then we'll take a look at the demand side issues of those material resources in connection with our low carbon energy technologies. And what are the supply side issues? We'll take a look at those. And there are very unique and interesting properties of these material resources in connection to the high technology product and low carbon energy technologies. And we'll take a look at those unique properties. And we'll talk about a little bit of the envisaging the future, what we can actually expect in the future. So objective here is that, well, the primary objective is, of course, just to provide an overview. And these are the works in progress. So there is no real new findings, so to say, coming out of here. But as a part of the learning process, I'm sharing this information with you, mainly about demand side, supply side, and those unique properties, very interesting properties, and build a common understanding about what should we expect in the future. And probably the most important thing here is that to identify opportunities for collaboration. So I'm new here. It has been only 8 months so far. I know that great expertise in this campus around this Energy Efficiency Institute, and I would love to build up collaborative relationship with many of you. Okay, so suppose that, let me ask you a question first. So suppose that in 2004, you happen to spend $500 to buy something that looks useless like this. So this looks quite useless, isn't it? And in 2008, June 2008, about 4 years later, you sold it. And surprisingly, you've got 11,000 out of it. The same amount, you invested 500 and bought this material, and 4 years and 4 months later, and you sold it, and you've got 11,000. What a good investment, isn't it? So you're very much excited. So okay, so I will make a big money out of this. So let's invest 100,000 on it. So you immediately purchase the same product, same material, with $100,000 in 2008, and sold it in 2 months later, and it became 7,600. So sounds like the story of your house, isn't it? Yeah? But this is not your house. This material is, what is this material? Can anyone guess what this material could be? Any guess? Neodymium? Very close. It can be. It could have been actually neodymium too, but not as much as this kind of fluctuation. So this material is rhodium. Rhodium, use it in many different applications like coating and also catalytic converters. We are increasing the use of the rhodium, especially in high technology products. So these materials like rhodium, indium, vanadium, gallium, some of the things that we will look into, has very interesting properties. So those metals are strongly tied to emerging technologies. So without those materials, emerging technologies, some of the emerging technologies that we will talk about will not be able to produce. And it has very unique characteristics in supply-demand dynamics. And there is a great inhomogeneity in supplying of those materials. So there are a lot of geopolitical influences around these materials, and we'll also take a look at those issues. So just putting things in perspective. So how big of the issue of these materials and what are the perceptions around those materials around the world. So many of you may remember that in September 2008, about 3-4 months ago, there were some interesting issues between Japan and China. Senkaku's Island, it is a number of islands that has long been a dispute, territorial dispute between China and Japan. And there were several Chinese fishermen trespassed the alleged border to Japan, and Japanese government basically quarantined those Chinese fishermen. And then China was very angry about it, and China didn't do anything official. However, unofficially, they stopped the shipment of rare earth elements to Japan. So everything was unofficial, but we know that, well, there are some government influence behind it. And then, not even in a week, but within a day, Japan said that we will release those fishermen without any condition. So rare earth element, export of rare earth element from China to Japan was a really big deal. It's a big concern from Japan. China is currently occupying about 97% of the global rare earth element market. So without the export from China, there are a lot of product cannot be produced in Japan. And it was not only Japan, but all other countries, all other developed countries that are producing high technology product are really anxious about this. So what happened was that in the United States, we sent the top officials, top diplomats to China after this crisis, and then they've got just this. So in Washington Post in October 30th, China on Saturday assured the United States that it would continue the export of crucial rare earth minerals that Beijing is believed to have halted as a way to pressure Japan. So a lot of countries are basically putting a lot of interest to those rare earth elements exported from Japan, from China. So Toyota pulled out very quickly a working group, task force on rare earth elements because of this issue. And it's believed that Toyota is holding a lot of private stockpiles of those rare earth elements by itself. So a lot of companies, a lot of nations are very much concerned about this rare earth element issues last September. Then the question is, okay, so there are a lot of buzz around rare earth elements, like sky's falling, we are running out of rare earth elements, and China will shut down its door. So what can we do? So how big of a deal it is? So total amount of rare earth element export from China in 2010 is about $650 million last year, 2010. It's very up-to-date statistics. So $650 million is it big or small? Let's compare with some other metals. Lithium in 2008 was about $500 million. So annual production of lithium globally was about $500 million. So rare earth element basically is a lanthanide. There are about 7, 8 very important metals within the rare earth element categories. So putting them all together, it was only $650 million. Lithium alone was more than, is about $500 million annual production rate. And if you compare them with other bulk metals like copper, it is at least 2 orders of magnitude difference. So copper, global market annual production of copper is around $100 billion annually. So lithium and rare earth elements basically is nothing as compared to copper. And aluminum, again, is another order of magnitude difference. And if you compare them with crude oil, basically it's nothing. So why then? Why countries are so much anxious and worried about these rare earth elements? There are good reasons behind it, so we'll talk about those issues. So in summary, high-tech materials, especially rare earth elements, are a hot issue. It's undeniable. But its economic importance is nowhere near those of the bulk resources as of yet. What makes it really interesting is, however, the unique supply-demand dynamics and the limited substitutability of these materials, which makes them really essential for the future technology development. So today what we're going to do is to talk about a number of technologies like photovoltaics, wind turbines, solid-state lighting, and batteries and fuel cells, and associated materials like rare earth element and lithium and platinum, palladium, indium, gallium, tantalum. I will not go into the details of any of these, but we will touch upon many of those technologies and associated materials. So again, we'll talk about demand-side characteristics and supply-side characteristics, and what are those unique properties, and what should we expect in the future, and what are the research priorities. So on the demand side, just about 3-4 weeks ago, DOE released a very interesting report about strategic materials for future energy supply. So DOE identified about 14 materials for its strategic importance in supplying future energy. They are related to solar cells, photovoltaics, especially thin films, where indium, gallium, tellurides are identified as strategic materials. And wind turbines, we use permanent magnets, which made it much more efficient and much more compact. We are using a number of different rare earth elements here. Neodymium was one of the materials that is really essential in making this permanent magnets, and their prices has been really increasing dramatically, about more than 10 times over a number of years of time frame. And for the vehicles, plug-in battery vehicles or any other vehicles that uses electric motor also uses those permanent magnets. So a number of rare earth elements are used there. For batteries, a number of lanthanides and also lithium and cobalt, they are used for batteries. For lighting, solid-state lighting, basically we have light source and phosphor that makes a white light out of it. So phosphors using a number of lanthanides. That has been an issue from time to time. So in a periodic table, these are the elements that DOE identified as strategic metals for future energy supply. Again, some other examples. So this is triple junction cell, and as we can see, we have indium gallium phosphide, indium gallium arsenide, germanium, and their coverage of spectrum. And LEDs, basically we have light source, and it can the phosphors can be coated around it, or it can be remotely applied like this, generating white light out of it. And different lighting technologies are using different elements for those phosphors. So they have different implications on materials availability in the future. And in a lot of cases, many of those high technology materials and products and low carbon energy technologies are improving efficiency by means of adding new and exotic materials. So one of the examples shown here is that this is the improved magnet strength over time. And as you can see that we have increased the magnet strength enormously over time, but it was achieved by means of using the materials like samarium or neodymium and iron and boron type of materials. Similar examples can be found in photovoltaics. Photovoltaic efficiency improved dramatically over time. And many of those achievements were made by adding exotic materials like tellurium and gallium, etc. This is a Tesla, which is battery electric vehicle, and from 0 kilometer to 100 kilometer, it takes something like 3.7 seconds. So very fast. It uses, of course, a lithium-ion battery, and per one laptop like this, we use about 5 grams of lithium And in order to run Tesla or any other plug-in hybrid car, we need 15 to 20 kilogram of lithium. So you're basically carrying 3,000 to 4,000 laptop batteries to operate these cars. So, of course, plug-in hybrid batteries, plug-in hybrid cars is good in terms of reducing reliance on fossil fuels and reducing air emissions, especially from tailpipe air emissions. But at the same time, there is trade-off between additional use of materials and reduced energy consumption by those plug-in hybrid vehicles. So the technologies in question that are related to those use of elements that are concerned are photovoltaics, wind turbines, solid-state lighting, batteries, fuel cells. These are all energy-related technologies, either energy-saving or renewable energy technologies. And also there are other technologies that are not directly related to energy saving or energy supply, but are very much relevant for these materials, which are display, mobile communications, semiconductors, and catalyzed and catalytic converters, aviation turbines, etc. So if we look at the demand side of low carbon energy technologies, I'm sorry about this acronym here, this is low carbon energy technologies. So demand on lower carbon energy technologies are growing very fast. So for instance, installed photovoltaic capacity is doubling every 2 years. So annual growth rate goes about 41%. So anything doubling in 2 years, this is something big. And wind power annual growth rate in 2010 reached 31%, with which we can double the wind power capacity every 2.5 years. Lithium battery demand is expected to grow 14 times by 2020. LED market is expected to grow at 9.4% per year until 2020. So we are seeing huge demand pull of those technologies, low carbon energy technologies. So some of the examples, again, released last year, a report by IEA. This is the photovoltaic roadmap, so kind of scenario, or let's say policy target. So we are currently here, and this is photovoltaic electricity generation in terawatt hour. What we are seeing now is basically nothing as compared to what we are going to see in the future in 20 years of down the road. So huge increase in photovoltaic installed capacity we should observe. So in summary, there is enormous policy-backed pull from the market, and demand on high-tech metals will continue to increase accordingly. And it is not only those high-tech products, but also we should not forget that there are other demands on those materials. So there are demands from other technologies than low carbon energy technologies, and also there are demand from speculation and hedging. So for instance, this is another example. This is a semiconductor technology. In 1980s, we were using only 11 elements in periodic table to produce or fabricate the semiconductors. 1990s, we added 4 elements, and 2000, we added 45 more elements. And now they are saying that they are using about 80 different elements for semiconductor fabrication. So it is not only the volume of those material consumption is increasing, but also the breadth of the material consumption within the periodic table is widening. Opening the cellular phone, you will be able to find a lot of different materials. Around 20 to 30 different elements you can find within your cellular phone. And I'm keep receiving this kind of emails. I don't know if you're receiving these emails or not, but like how to invest rare earth metals. As I have shown to you, I mean, those price volatility is what makes investors very excited. So they are very much excited about the strong rare earth elements market, and there are a number of funds being built, investment funds being built around the rare earth elements, which basically exacerbate the shortage and the price volatility of those rare earth elements. So that thus far was supply side aspect and the demand side of aspect on those materials. And what about supply side? By the way, if there's any questions or comments from the floor, feel free to raise your hand, and we would like to make it more interactive as much as possible. Okay. All right. So from supply side, there are also very interesting things, a lot of interesting things going on in supply side. So when price of materials increase, then so does the greed over those materials. So there are a number of interesting things going on, especially by planned economies. This is very interesting things because in the United States, we hope that market will regulate everything so that the government does not have to do anything. But those planned economy, they know that how much of materials will be needed in order to grow in the future, and they plan things ahead. I had the privilege to participate one of the High Council meeting in China. It is very interesting to see that in China they set the target of economic growth rate. So the politicians, basically officials, gathered together. Well, let's say, well, next year's economic growth rate should be 9.5%. There's a target, and the rest of the economy should work hard to meet the target. So normally in the United States, the other way around. So economy works hard, and then after the year, then we collect the statistics and say that, well, last year's economic growth rate was 4%. But in China, it's the other way around. So government officials set the target, and the rest of the economy follows. And so China knows pretty much probably the best about how much of materials will be needed to fuel their growth and where to support those supplies. So in 2004, Chinalco, which is a Chinese aluminum company, it's a state company, invested on Rio Tinto. Rio Tinto is one of the largest mining companies in the world. BHP Billiton is the largest, and Rio Tinto is probably the second largest. There was a $14 billion US. There was historically so far the largest investment from China on foreign companies. And the same year, China invested Congo and established a company between Chinese and Congo, Republic of Congo, called Sokomin. And Sokomin has more or less the exclusive right to develop the mines in Congo. Congo, by the way, a Central African country, has a lot of metallic resources. And some of the metals, like cobalt, is only found in Congo. There are not much of other countries that can supply those materials. So this development from China, of course, what is behind is the materials and resources that can be supplied from those routes. And Russia, this man, I'm very sympathetic about this man. He was the CEO, Mikhail. He was the CEO of Rosneft. Rosneft was the largest refinery company in Russia as of 2006. Rosneft at that time occupied about 4% of Russian GDP, so big company in Russia. And unfortunately, he tried to sell this company to ExxonMobil, American company. And someone high up in the air, probably Vladimir Putin, didn't like the idea. And this company was investigated by the prosecutors, and they found to have some fraud in their accounts. And they basically, annual production, so annual sales amount of tax was levied from this company. So what happened was that, well, this company bankrupt, of course. You cannot pay tax with annual sales. So this company bankrupt, and who bought it? It was Yukos. Yukos is a state company. And Yukos was barely surviving. He could not stand alone. But Yukos, without much money, he could just buy it. So in Russia and also in Venezuela and a lot of countries, government is trying to expand their influence over the resources extraction and resources availability, securing resources availability. So this can be found along with the price increase that we could observe in between 2000 to 2007. So if you remember, if you recall, just before the economic meltdown, which looks like, yeah, thinking about the economic meltdown, it looks like it has been ages, but it has been only 2008 to until now. So until 2008, we had a lot of raw material price rallies. Housing prices were going up and raw material prices going up, and which is a bit similar to what we are observing last 6 months or so. If you look at the price increase, annual price increase rate between this period, for instance, indium, vanadium, molybdenum, and rhodium, they were about 80 to 100% of annual price increase rate, which means that for indium, this year is, let's say, $10, the next year is $20, the next year is $40, and $80, $160. So enormous increase in prices during this period. And right after this period, of course, we had the economic meltdown, and then prices has been plunged. But just before that, we had a lot of price increase for those materials. So it is, of course, related to the increasing attempts by the government, especially planned economy, over material resources supply. So, and another interesting characteristics on the supply side of these materials is that, well, there are limited volume of supply, of course, and there is a high dependence on host materials. We'll talk about that a little later. And there is a very high elastic response to demand, which is very characteristic to these high-tech materials. So in terms of the supply, let's take a look at this material, which looks as ugly as the other one. What was that? The rhodium, yeah. So iridium, this is iridium. Iridium is one of the densest material, and total annual production goes only 3 metric tons per year. It's a global annual production. And it's very dense, so if you put them together, then it can be contained within your cabin luggage. So you can carry your annual production of iridium with your cabin luggage. Nevertheless, it is used for a variety of applications like satellite communication and high-end spark plugs and some audio communication technologies. But its production is only 3 tons. So if 1 ton is disappearing, then basically 1/3 of the production is gone. So because of the limited supply and relatively low price, raw price here meaning that, well, multiplying the price versus the volume, basically if you have enough money, then you can just buy the annual production volume of that iridium. So it's not very difficult. So it is very easy to play with those with the hedging and investment aiming at sharp price increase. So China is expecting to narrow its door for its rare earth elements export. So in 2000, neodymium and lanthanum and cerium, they had tariffs. Well, neodymium had the 15% of tariff, and lanthanum and cerium, they didn't really have any tariff. From this year, so far now for 10 days, they have increased their tariff 25% into 25%. And they are also, so their rare earth elements are exported based on quota. So beyond certain quota, they will not export those rare earth elements. And in 2000, they exported 35,000 tons of rare earth elements. And this year, it is expected that they will export only 30,000 tons of rare earth elements. So given that 97% of rare earth element supply is made by China, so this is a big difference to the world market. So of course there are responses to this kind of actions. So many countries are looking for diversification of material supply for those materials. And Japan and India very recently announced that they will work together to secure some of the rare earth elements and other strategic metals. So India, apparently they have large reserves, fair amount of reserves, which was not developed at all. And Japan and India will work together to utilize those reserves. And in the United States, before the rise of China, actually US was the largest supplier of rare earth elements in the global market. Actually, it is in California. Mountain Pass area was the largest supplier of rare earth elements. And that has been closed for a long time because of the cheap Chinese rare earth elements. Now they are reopening, not because of the price competition, but also because of the supply security for the US industries. And there are new investment being made on recycling technologies, recycling of those technologies. So what are the key characteristics of these materials? First, the recyclability of these materials are very limited. So this is from the UN report. So they draw a Venn diagram, the materials with serious supply risk, rapid demand growth, and serious recycling restrictions. You can see rare earth element, Re is a rare earth element, not uranium. And many of the materials of interest like palladium, platinum, tellurium, indium, gallium, germanium, rubidium, they belong to all these three categories. This is a thermodynamic limit of recyclability when things are put into the copper smelter. So there are many different ways of, Archo, you have a question? Yeah.
Serious recycling restrictions, are you going to talk about what those may be?
Sure. Sure, yeah. We can talk a little bit about that. So the problem here is that, well, metal recycling, we can take many different forms of metal recycling. The traditional forms of metal recycling for copper smelters and aluminum smelters and iron smelters are like this. You're putting all of them together to a smelter and increase the temperature, and some of them will be remained separated as a slag, some of them will be separated as gas, some of them will be in metallic phase, so that you can separate things. The problem is that many of those materials that are in question here, gallium, germanium, boron, tungsten, magnesium, zinc here, will be separated as part of slag. So once it is put into slag, it's very difficult to separate from thereof. So traditional smelter approach is not really working very well for those rare earth elements. Not only because of this thermodynamic limit, but also because of the amount of those metals in the product is so limited, it's very small. So separating them does not really make economic sense. So these days, what people are trying to do in terms of the recycling is not really very much about the thermal technologies, but solvent extraction and biological and physical absorption technologies are being developed. One of the technologies that I was really amazed about was the recycling of platinum from road sweepers. So we are using platinum for catalytic converters in our car, and much of them will just remain within the honeycomb, but fair amount of it is exhausted with the very fine particles. So where do they end up is that they are basically end up on the road side. And the higher concentration of platinum is found in road sweepers. And road sweeper, basically the garbage can, if you scrape those surfaces out, they have fairly high concentration of platinum. But you cannot put those into the smelters because of the efficiency, and the yield is too low. So some British scientists, they developed a bacteria will selectively absorb those platinum, and you can separate those platinum from those bacteria. So interesting development going on for the absorption technologies, not much from the thermal extraction side. Another interesting characteristics about these materials is very unique price elasticity responses. So this is an example of tantalum. So tantalum is used for a variety of different applications. One of them is superalloy. This particular example is for turbine blades. And GE, General Electric, is not only electronic appliances company, but also it produces a lot of turbines, industrial turbines and jet engines. And they introduced an alloy using this tantalum. Tantalum, before tantalum, there were not much use of tantalum. And in about late 1970s, they introduced a new superalloy using tantalum. And what happened was that, price of tantalum, which was fairly stable over a long period of time, start to surge with the introduction of this tantalum alloy. The problem here is that tantalum production or supply is very limited. So any additional demand increase will basically increase the price. The problem is that tantalum is produced as a co-element or byproduct of mother metals. So if the mother metals or host metals production is not increased, you cannot actually increase the tantalum's production. So basically, with additional demand, you have more demand, but supply is still constant, which is not the case for ordinary product. For ordinary product, when your when your demand increases, price goes up, and then supply also goes up, so that there are some balances are made. But for these rare earth elements and exotic metals, it is not the case. So supply is not increased, even if the demand is increasing, and also the price is increasing. So what we see is the sharp price surge of these materials. And then this price went down only after GE decided not to go with this particular type of alloy. History repeats itself, and what the lessons learned from one sector is not really transferred to another. So we have seen exactly the same pattern in 2010 to 2001, when cellular phone companies introduced the capacitor using tantalum. And this was the time that GE finally decided not to go with the tantalum alloy anymore. So this price elasticity response is very characteristic to these materials. And another interesting characteristic is the impact of these price increase or shortage of those materials are very targeted. So it is not like iron or aluminum or crude oil where the entire economy is affected, but these materials are used for very specialized products. So they are very specific industry or product group that are targeted, selectively targeted by these materials. So this is, I will not go into detail, but this is a table from a report from GE. General Electric has investigated on the risk associated with the supply of those metals, and they identified so supply and price risk and impact on GE for various different metals. And for the sake of business security, they are not releasing all the names of these metals, and only one, rhenium. So rhenium they identified as a critical metal. They will strategically investigate further. So as I mentioned before, this is the co-production tree. So many of those metals are not found alone. So we do not really have bismuth ore per se. So bismuth is produced as a byproduct of lead separation, and lead is found in zinc ore, for instance. So as I mentioned, if the lead production is not increased, then increasing bismuth production is very much limited. What is very interesting is that lead-free soldering, which has been a great success by European countries and Japan, without using lead, instead of using lead, we are using bismuth and silver compound. And bismuth can only be found after lead. So even if we replaced lead, still we are producing fair amount of lead because we need bismuth And in order to make bismuth, we need to have lead anyway. So without really understanding those dynamics or linkages between those materials, it's very difficult to make a sensible policy out of these metals. So similar similar picture, but it's in the wheel type. So what you can expect in the near future. So rare earth, what is very important to understand is that rare earth elements are not actually rare. So rare earth elements somehow named without reflecting what they really are. So rare earth elements, we have fair amount of reserves for rare earth elements. Reserves for other metals, such as lithium, are generally abundant. So lithium, there are a lot of concerns about lithium, but the lithium is fairly abundant. So if we look at the reserve amount, there is not much things that we should worry about. However, what is very important to understand here is that the production capacity cannot be turned on immediately. So what we will going to see is probably short-term to mid-term unbalance between production and demand, which will raise the price in the short term. But the real concern is not the absolute shortage of those materials, but the relative shortage or price increase in the short to mid-term in the future. So looking at some of the examples of that, this is the case of neodymium. This is from the DOE report released last December. So what it shows is that, well, this is the green line is demand, and this red line here, perpetuated line here, is a 2015 estimated supply. So what you can see here is the supply is under the demand, meaning that we will have a shortage in neodymium supply by 2015. However, neodymium supply can increase after probably 2018, 2020, because there are some time needed for exploration and establishing the infrastructure for mining and refinery. So those things will take time. So those time gap will likely increase the price in the short run until 2015 and around. But it's not really absolute shortage. So that has been already reflected in the price increase of some of those materials like shown here. These are all lanthanides, rare earth elements. So price increase 14 times, 13 times, 12 times, etc. So it's likely that we will keep seeing those kind of price increase and volatility in the near future. So in summary, what to expect is short to mid-term shortage in supply and probably short to mid-term price shock is something that we can expect. And what they will fuel is possible hedging and false demand, which will exacerbate the problem in the near future. And there might be some potential bilateral coalition between countries, as we have seen between China and Japan and India, and certain cartelization and nationalism over resources may occur in the near future too. So very briefly, I think these are the research priorities from this presentation. Much of the materials used and recyclability is determined on the drawing board by the designer. So depending on how things are designed, we may or may not have to use much of those materials, and we may or may not be able to recycle much of those materials. So material with conscious design is very important for reducing the use of materials and designing for disassembly and recyclability. And I think the recycling technologies for those materials are also part of the priority research. And collaboration between design, fabrication, material science, and industry ecology and metallurgy would be very much desirable. So far the paradigm was that, well, the material scientists, well, try to add different materials together to improve the efficiency without really thinking how to separate once those materials added. and how to recycle those materials once they are added, and how much do we have those materials, and what are the supply security of those materials. But those information should be gathered together in order to make a conscious decision and design of those low carbon energy technologies. So that's what I've prepared for today. Thank you. Thank you.
What you said about the recyclability of rare earth magnets and symbols, like basically impossible. And technology?
The magnets are relatively easier to recycle, actually. More difficult to recycle is tiny bit of amount of metal doped into semiconductors, for instance. Then it's much more difficult. But magnets are basically bulk material there, so it is relatively easier, I believe. Yep.
Even when they're made in ceramics?
That one I'm not sure. Someone else can answer that question? Recyclability of magnets?
It's very exciting.
Thank you.
Are you enjoying this?
I'm very much enjoying this. I'm very much excited about the whole development in this area. Very rapid. And most of the materials that I presented were published within 2 months or so. So it's very dynamic field these days. A lot of materials are out there very recently. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Often when things are in short supply, or like during wartime, for instance, there's a big press to find synthetic substitutes. Is there any prospects for that for rare earth elements?
There are efforts being made to find substitutes for those materials. But we should be reminded that the reason why we are using these materials is to generate very special properties from those materials. And there are not many materials that we can find outside those materials that we have reviewed that can generate those properties. And periodic table is basically our playing field, and we cannot think of anything outside the periodic table. And as I said, we are currently using about 80 different metals for semiconductors and high-tech products. And finding substitutes is a great challenge so far.
Sorry again, some of these slides went by quickly. What about the some of the more exotic superconducting materials? There's some fairly rare materials that go into some of the superconductors.
That's very interesting. I'm very much interested in superconducting materials, but I haven't gone through the literature review and analysis yet. So sorry that I cannot answer the question, Sean.
You haven't mentioned Iridium, but that's something important to fiber optics and also adoption, I guess, in particular. How rare is that? And low demand doesn't show up on the chart.
Well, the reserve of erbium is not really rare. Reserve of erbium is quite okay. The problem is that there are not many places where we have the production infrastructure of erbium. So again, oligopolic or monopolic structure in supplying of erbium is what concerns many people. So there is a great supply security risk, but absolute shortage, no. Arturo?
Well, you mentioned 2 companies, Toyota and GE, that seem to be beginning to think about this. How prevalent do you think that is, that companies are beginning to see what their potential risk is? Is that something that you see that more companies are beginning to pay attention?
The companies like Toyota and GE, especially, they are very much concerned because GE is using rhenium, for instance. Rhenium is indispensable for their turbines. And without rhenium, basically, they cannot build those high pressure, high temperature turbines. But the companies like ExxonMobil, for instance, or DuPont, which are mainly using crude oil feedstock, they are of course less concerned about those metals, except for the fact that those refineries are using fair amount of catalyzed, and catalyzed are also fairly, they are belonging to those metal groups. But catalyzed are generally easier to recycle. For instance, rhodium production about last year, I believe, was 22 tons of rhodium, and 7 tons out of 20 tons came from recycling those catalyzed. So catalyzed, they exist as a bulk materials with the honeycombs, etc. So just taking it out of there and then recycling is relatively easier. So it really depends on which industry that we are talking about and which technology is affected by those materials. Very much selective. Yeah.
Are there any estimates, reliable estimates of the world reserves? How much remains in the ground, and if so, what are the projected to exhaust that supply? How many years of current and projected utilization rates?
Sure. Yes and no. The U.S. Geological Survey is probably the world's largest organization that compiles that data. So what is the reserve and reserve base? The reserve is the amount of resources under the earth crust that can be extracted with the current technology and economic condition. And reserve base is basically how much of them is on earth crust without thinking of economics of extraction. And those data are regularly compiled by U.S. Geological Survey. But the problem is that those data were compiled relying primarily on the company-supplied information. And if you are the mine, if you own a mine that is producing rhodium, and you will not say that, well, you don't have to worry about rhodium supply. We have plenty of them. You will not say that. So there is always, the information gap. So we are probably underestimating reserves, but that is something that we don't know. And what is at stake is too high, so that we cannot just speculate out of those numbers. So that is an important challenge. That is a big problem, indeed. Yes, Stephanie.
Can you clarify something? When you say that China has 97% of the world's reserves, does that mean
It's not the reserve, but it's a supply. Yes.
That means a big point, and it's not necessarily within their borders.
They are within their borders. So they are currently supplying rare earth elements almost exclusively from the mines within their borders. However, they are not the large. They do not hold the largest reserve of those rare earth elements. So there are other countries like U.S. We have fair amount of reserve of rare earth element. The only thing is that we are not really producing anything, especially recently. But we can produce it, but it takes some time to catch up with the production rate volume. Question in the back?
You mentioned at the end materials conscious design. How much of that do you know is already being done? Like, for example, I know some solar panels are already manufactured kind of trying to not use certain materials, and are also designed to be able to be recycled to end their life. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. For photovoltaics, tellurium was a problem. So telluride materials used in photovoltaics, nowadays many companies are trying to avoid tellurium. And for high technology product, like as shown in GE's case, they are very much conscious about those materials. Because of the fact that for the last 10 years or so, we have seen a lot of price increase of those materials. So they have to be conscious, not only because of the supply security issues, but also because of their bottom line. So they need to be competitive using less of those materials. So they are very conscious about it. The problem is that when new demand is coming on and new product is coming online by a producer who does not really have those prior knowledge about how things went, then, well, there is a new risk of making mistakes, as we have seen in a cellular phone example. But existing companies who have been using those exotic materials, they are very much conscious about what's going on in the market.
Are there any tables?
Probably first, yeah, in the back.
You mentioned the influence of government policy and nationalization on the supply side.
Mm-hmm.
I like the prospect for that on the demand side.
Demand side. Yeah.
Does it make sense for somebody to be driving around 1 kilogram of lithium? Is that the highest use? And in a constrained world,
That's a very good question, yeah. It might be, personally, can be a very good investment in the short run. So I think that's the best comment that I can make. I cannot speculate. And about 5 years ago, I told my friend who had some money, disposable income left, and I jokingly I told him that, well, if you have some money, buy platinum. And he did, and he made quite a fortune out of it. So I hope that the message. By the way, the message here is not about buying neodymium. So I'm not encouraging you to buy neodymium, but certainly, as a personal level, it could be an option. Okay. So yeah, last question.
Seen any tables of how to express it, the cost in a product that is related to these difficult to get? So if the price of the material goes up by a factor of 10, how does it affect the price of the product? Like how in a $20,000 automobile, how much is something catalytic converter? Is it $1 or $1,000?
Very good question. So far, rare earth elements are making less than 1% of the cost of the production is, for photovoltaics. So it's not of a big deal as of yet. But think about this. As I said, for instance, lithium, which is currently fairly cheap, and we have enough amount of reserve. But as I said, there are about 14 times of demand increase envisaged over 2020. And for those materials with short supply, it is not very unusual to have 10 times of price increase. So if those kind of things are combined together, there is a very good chance that we will see those rare earth elements as a large chunk of the total cost of production. But we are not seeing that as of yet. But it is, there is very good prospect of that. Yep.
Last question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to congratulate you on giving what I think is the best talk that I've heard since coming to UCSB.
Thank you very much. I'm very much honored to be here. Thank you.